The rooftop helipad of Harrington Tower shimmered under the afternoon sun, and 47 floors below, Manhattan stretched out like a kingdom made of glass and steel, but nobody was looking at the view. Every single eye was fixed on the woman in the designer suit and the man in the faded gray coveralls standing 3 feet apart, separated by nothing but air and everything that privilege had ever built between two human beings. Victoria Harrington's laugh cut through the wind like broken glass as she gestured toward the sleek black helicopter behind her, its rotor still, its body gleaming like a predator waiting to be awakened. "You want respect," she said, loud enough for the crowd of executives and assistants gathered at the rooftop door to hear every syllable. "Fine, fly this helicopter right now, and I'll marry you. I'll give you half of everything I own." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the distant honking of taxis 47 floors below. The janitor, a black man with graying temples and hands that had known decades of work, looked at the helicopter, then back at the woman who had just turned his dignity into a punchline. And what he did next would change everything Victoria Harrington thought she knew about power, about worth, and about the dangerous game of underestimating the people you refuse to see. His name was Eric Thompson, and for 3 years he had moved through the halls of Harrington Financial like a ghost made of flesh and quiet purpose. Every morning at 5:15, before the sun had even begun to warm the concrete canyons of the city, Eric would badge into the service entrance, collect his cart of supplies, and begin the ritual that nobody ever thanked him for. He mopped the marble floors of the lobby until they reflected the crystal chandeliers like still water. He emptied the trash bins in corner offices where men in suits made decisions that affected thousands of lives without ever looking up when he entered. He scrubbed the bathroom tiles until they gleamed, polished the elevator buttons that hundreds of fingers touched every day, and replaced the paper towels in dispensers that people grabbed from without a second thought about who had filled them. Eric was 50, 3 years old, and he had the kind of face that carried stories in its lines, stories of places he'd been, things he'd survived, and a wisdom that came from watching the world while the world pretended not to see him. His hands were large and steady, the hands of a man who had never been afraid of hard work, and his eyes held a gentleness that seemed almost out of place in a building where gentleness was considered weakness. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his voice was deep and unhurried, like a river that had learned patience from flowing over stones for centuries. The other janitorial staff liked him. They said Eric was the kind of man who would give you his last $5 if you needed it, the kind who remembered your birthday and asked about your mother's surgery and actually listened to the answer. But to the executives of Harrington Financial, to the people who controlled the money and made the decisions, Eric Thompson was nothing but a uniform, a function, a pair of hands that existed only to keep their world clean so they didn't have to think about the mess. Victoria Harrington was 34 years old and had never once in her life been told no by anyone who mattered. She had inherited Harrington Financial from her father 3 years ago, stepping into the CEO position like it was a throne that had always been waiting for her, which, in a sense, it had. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished, precise, untouchable. Her blonde hair was always swept back in a style that probably cost more than Eric made in a week, and her suits were tailored so perfectly they seemed to have been sewn directly onto her body. She walked through the halls of her building like an empress surveying her domain, her heels clicking out a rhythm that made people straighten up and lower their eyes. And Victoria had a habit, a small one, really, in the grand scheme of her many flaws, of treating the service staff like furniture that occasionally needed to be moved out of her way. She never learned their names. She never said please or thank you. If a janitor was mopping when she needed to pass, she would stand there, silent, radiating impatience, until they scrambled to move their bucket and bow their heads in something that looked too much like shame. Eric Thompson had felt her gaze pass over him 100 times without ever landing, without ever seeing him as anything more than an obstacle between her and wherever she was going. But today was different. Today, for reasons that would soon become horrifyingly clear, Victoria Harrington was about to see Eric Thompson for the first time, and she was about to make the worst mistake of her privileged, sheltered, utterly unexamined life. It started in the executive elevator, which Eric was never supposed to use, which was why he was using the service elevator like he always did. But the service elevator had broken down 20 minutes ago, and now Eric was facing a choice between taking the executive elevator to the 47th floor to fix a burst pipe in the rooftop maintenance room, or letting water damage destroy electrical systems that could put the entire building at risk. So he made the practical choice, the responsible choice, and he stepped into the brushed steel cathedral of the executive elevator just as Victoria Harrington came sweeping around the corner with 3 members of her board and an expression that suggested the universe had just personally offended her. She stopped when she saw him. Not stopped walking, stopped existing in the way she normally existed, confident and untouchable. For a moment, her face went through several expressions, like a slot machine trying to land on the right emotion, before finally settling on something between disgust and disbelief. What are you doing in here? The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation dressed in 4 words. Eric looked at her steadily, the way he looked at everyone, with that calm, unhurried gaze that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than ego or fear. Service elevator's broken, ma'am. There's a water emergency on 47. I need to get up there before it causes more damage. Victoria's eyes traveled from his face to his coveralls to the toolbox in his hand, and something in her expression tightened, like she was watching a cockroach crawl across her pristine floor. There are stairs, she said. 47 floors. One of the board members, an older man named Patterson who had been with the company since Victoria's father ran it, shifted uncomfortably. Victoria, perhaps? No. She cut him off without looking at him, her eyes still fixed on Eric like he was a puzzle she was determined to solve with sheer contempt. I don't share elevators with the help. That's not elitism, that's just protocol. Standards exist for a reason. If we start making exceptions, where does it end? Next, he'll want to eat in the executive cafeteria. He'll want stock options. He'll want to be treated like he actually matters to this company. The words hung in the air, ugly and exposed, and Eric felt something shift in his chest. Not anger exactly, but something older and more tired than anger. Something that had been sitting there for 53 years, waiting for moments exactly like this one. Eric stepped out of the elevator. He did it quietly, without drama, without the satisfaction of a slammed door or a bitter word. He simply stepped back onto the polished marble floor and let the doors close between him and the woman who had just reduced him to nothing in front of her entire board. But Victoria wasn't finished. Something about his quiet dignity, his refusal to grovel or apologize for existing, seemed to infuriate her even more. The elevator doors opened again. She had pressed the button to hold them. "You know what I don't understand," she said, stepping out to face him while her board members watched with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to morbidly fascinated. "I don't understand why people like you don't just do better, get an education, start a business, learn a skill that actually matters. You've been pushing a mop around my building for years, and you'll die pushing a mop, and then your children will push mops, and your grandchildren, and on and on. Generation after generation of people who just can't seem to figure out how to climb up from the bottom." The security guard at the nearby desk looked away. A young assistant clutched her tablet to her chest and pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible. Eric said nothing. He simply stood there, holding his toolbox, weathering her words like a cliff weathers the ocean. "What? Nothing to say." Victoria tilted her head, a cruel smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Or do you not have the education to form a response? Let me use smaller words. Why are you poor?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Eric looked at her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "Ma'am, I'm going to take the stairs now. The water damage isn't going to fix itself." He turned to go, but Victoria's voice stopped him. "Wait," the word cracked like a whip. "You don't get to walk away from me. Do you understand who I am? Do you understand what I could do to you with a single phone call? You'd never work in this city again. You'd never work anywhere again. I own people who own people who own people like you." Eric turned back, and something in his eyes had changed, not to anger, but to something that looked almost like pity. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly, and Victoria Harrington laughed. It was the kind of laugh that beautiful, powerful people reserve for moments when the absurdity of the lower classes becomes too much to bear. "Oh, I know everything about you. I know your type. I've known it my entire life. You're nobody. You have nothing. You will always have nothing. And if you think standing there with your quiet dignity makes you better than me—" She stopped, and her eyes lit up with a sudden, malicious idea. "Actually," Victoria said, and her voice had taken on a new quality, theatrical, performative, playing to the growing crowd of employees who had gathered to witness the spectacle. "Let me prove a point. Follow me, everyone. Follow me. I want you all to see something." She swept toward the rooftop access door, her heels clicking out that familiar rhythm of power and certainty, and the crowd followed like she was the Pied Piper of corporate humiliation. Eric hesitated for only a moment before following too. He didn't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to see how far she would take this. Maybe it was something else entirely. Something that had been sleeping inside him for 3 years, waiting for exactly the right moment to wake up. The rooftop helipad was bathed in afternoon light, and Victoria's personal helicopter sat at its center like a giant metal insect, its black paint gleaming, its rotors still and silent. She walked right up to it, ran her hand along its flank like she was petting a favorite horse, and then turned to face Eric and the crowd of at least 30 people who had gathered to watch. "This," she announced, "is a Eurocopter Econi 55. It costs $12 million. It can carry 12 passengers at speeds up to 175 miles per hour. It requires over 200 hours of specialized training to fly, plus FOSS certification, plus years of experience. My personal pilot has logged over 5,000 flight hours." She paused, savoring the moment. "You," she pointed at Eric, "push him up." The crowd was silent. Some looked uncomfortable. Others, the ambitious ones, the ones who hoped cruelty to the weak might earn them favor with the powerful, were smiling. "So here's what I'm going to do," Victoria continued. "I'm going to give you a chance to prove me wrong. Right here, right now. Fly this helicopter." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed nervously. "Fly it," Victoria repeated, her voice rising with theatrical grandeur. "Get it off this helipad, take it around the building, and land it safely. Do that, something that should be impossible for someone with your education, your background, your limitations, and I'll marry you. I'll make you my husband. I'll give you half of everything I own. I'll admit publicly that I was wrong about you, about all of you." She spread her arms wide, embracing the absurdity of her own cruelty. "But you can't, you won't, because you don't have what it takes, because people like you never have what it takes. Because the universe sorts people exactly where they belong, and you belong at the bottom, pushing a mop until the day you die." The rooftop was silent except for the wind. Eric stood perfectly still, his toolbox in his hand, 30 pairs of eyes burning into him from all directions. He could feel the weight of their gazes, some pitying, some mocking, some desperately hoping he would find a way to make this powerful woman eat her words. In that moment, he became aware of every detail around him with crystalline clarity, the way the wind tugged at the cuffs of his coveralls, the distant wail of a siren 47 floors below, the tiny tremor in Victoria's hand that suggested maybe, somewhere beneath all that armor, she knew she had gone too far but couldn't find her way back. He thought about his life, the roads he'd traveled, the skies he'd crossed, the things he'd built and lost and built again. He thought about his mother who had cleaned office buildings until her back gave out, who had told him that dignity wasn't something people gave you, but something you carried inside yourself where no one could touch it. He thought about the men and women he'd served with, in places whose names still made his heart ache, who had looked at him and seen not a color or a class, but a brother, a leader, a man you could trust when the world was falling apart around you. And he thought about this moment, this choice, and what he wanted it to mean. "You're sure about this?" he asked quietly. Victoria laughed again, but there was a new edge to it now, uncertainty trying to dress itself as contempt. "What? Are you actually considering it? This should be good. By all means. Get in the helicopter. Show everyone how far out of your depth you are." Eric set down his toolbox. He straightened his coveralls with a small, precise gesture, like a soldier adjusting his uniform before inspection. And then he walked toward the helicopter, and something in the way he moved made the crowd go silent again, made Victoria's smile falter just slightly, made the wind itself seem to pause and hold its breath. Eric reached the helicopter and paused with his hand on the door. He didn't open it. Instead, he turned to look at Victoria, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the rooftop. "My name," he said, "is Eric Eugene Thompson. I served 22 years in the United States Army. I completed my flight training at Fort Rucker in 1993. I logged 6,400 hours of flight time over 2 decades, flying Black Hawks in Somalia, Apaches in Iraq, and medical evacuation helicopters in Afghanistan. I was shot down twice. I received the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts. I have personally saved 217 lives through combat aviation and medical evacuation missions, and I was offered a position as a flight instructor at the Army Aviation Center of Excellence, which I turned down because I was ready to come home." The silence on that rooftop was absolute. Victoria's face had gone very still, like a mask that had suddenly forgotten how to move. "When I retired," Eric continued, "I used my military benefits and my savings to start a small aviation consulting company. I helped train pilots for private corporations and government agencies. The company grew. I made smart investments. I brought on partners. We expanded into helicopter emergency services, agricultural aviation, and private charter operations. He paused, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. That company is now called Thompson Aerospace Holdings. We operate over 140 aircraft across 3 continents. Our annual revenue last year was $478 million. I have a net worth, according to Forbes, of approximately $1.2 billion. The murmur that went through the crowd was like a physical wave, like the building itself had shifted on its foundations. Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her face had gone pale beneath her flawless makeup. As for why I'm here, Eric said, pushing a mop in your building, my mother cleaned these floors for 23 years. She raised me on what this company paid her, which wasn't much. She died 4 years ago, a month before I sold my company's first major government contract. She never got to see what I became. She never got to enjoy the money. She never got to stop working. He looked around the rooftop, at the gleaming helicopter, at the crowd of stunned faces, at the Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly in all directions. I bought this building 18 months ago. I own it through a holding company. I pay your rent. Ms. Harrington, I'm your landlord. I come here twice a week and clean the floors because it connects me to my mother's memory, because it keeps me humble, and because I wanted to understand how this company treats the people who work in the shadows. Now I know. Without another word, Eric opened the helicopter door and climbed into the pilot's seat. His movements were smooth, practiced, utterly confident. The movements of a man who had done this thousands of times in conditions far more dangerous than a sunny rooftop in Manhattan. The crowd watched, frozen, as he ran through the pre-flight checklist with the ease of someone tying their shoes. Victoria stumbled forward, one hand reaching out as if to stop him. But stop him from what? From proving her wrong. From exposing everything she believed about the world as the lie it had always been. The engine began to whine. The rotor started to turn. And then, with a grace that seemed almost impossible for something so large, the helicopter lifted off the helipad. It rose smoothly, steadily, the downdraft whipping Victoria's perfect hair into chaos, forcing the crowd to stumble backward. Eric took the aircraft up, banked it gently over the Manhattan skyline, circled the building once with the casual precision of someone who had done this in war zones while people were shooting at him, and then brought it back down so softly, so perfectly, that the skids kissed the helipad without a sound. He shut down the engine. The rotors slowed, then stopped. In the silence that followed, Eric climbed out of the helicopter and walked back to where Victoria was standing. She looked different now, smaller somehow, like something essential had been deflated inside her. The armor of her certainty had cracked, and underneath it was just a woman who had built her entire identity on the lie that she was better than other people. The offer was marriage and half of everything you own, Eric said quietly. I don't want either. I have my own money. I have my own life. I have things that matter to me more than anything you could offer. Victoria's eyes were wet, whether from shame, from the wind, or from something breaking inside her. It was impossible to say. But here's what's going to happen, Eric continued, and his voice was gentle now, almost kind. The voice of a man who had seen enough suffering in the world that he couldn't find pleasure even in justified revenge. Tomorrow morning, you're going to call a meeting of every janitorial and maintenance worker in this building. You're going to apologize to them, not for me, but for every time you looked through them, every time you treated them like they didn't matter, every time you made them feel small so you could feel big. You're going to learn their names. You're going to double their salaries. I'll cover the cost myself. And you're going to remember every single day for the rest of your life that you don't know someone's story just by looking at their uniform. He picked up his toolbox from where he had left it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a water leak to fix. He walked toward the rooftop access door, passing through the crowd that parted for him like water around a stone. At the door, he paused and looked back. One more thing, he said. My mother's name was Dorothy Thompson. She worked here from 1974 to 1997. She never missed a day. She never complained. And she was worth more than everyone in this building combined, including me. He disappeared through the door. The crowd remained frozen, staring at the space where he had been, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Victoria Harrington stood alone on the helipad, her designer suit rumpled by the helicopter's downdraft, her certainty scattered like leaves in a storm, facing for the first time in her life the question she had never had to ask before. Who am I if I'm not better than everyone else? The next morning, true to Eric's request, or perhaps demand, Victoria called the meeting. 43 maintenance and janitorial workers gathered in the main conference room on the 30th floor, a room most of them had only ever seen while emptying trash cans after everyone else had gone home. Victoria stood at the front, looking nothing like the untouchable queen she had been the day before. She looked tired, she looked human, and when she spoke, her voice cracked in places where it had never cracked before. She said their names, every single one. She had stayed up all night learning them. She apologized without excuses, without deflections, without the careful legal language that her advisors had probably begged her to use. She just said she was sorry, and she meant it, and everyone in that room could tell the difference between performance and truth. Eric wasn't there. He had already gone back to his other life, the one with the board meetings and the charitable foundations and the aviation empire that spanned continents. But he had left something behind in that building, in that company, in the heart of a woman who had never been forced to look in the mirror before. Victoria Harrington didn't become a good person overnight. That's not how humans work. But she started asking questions she had never asked before. She started noticing people she had never noticed before. She started wondering what other stories were hiding in plain sight, what other hidden depths were walking past her every day in uniform she had trained herself not to see. Here's what we forget. In a world that teaches us to measure people by their job titles and their bank accounts and the labels on their clothes, everyone you meet is carrying a story you know nothing about. The woman bagging your groceries might have a PhD in literature and be writing a novel in her spare time. The man driving your taxi might have been a surgeon in another country before war or circumstance brought him here. The janitor pushing a mop through the halls of a gleaming tower might be a decorated war hero, a self-made billionaire, a son still grieving his mother's memory, or he might not be any of those things. He might just be a janitor, and that should be enough. That should be worthy of respect and dignity and basic human kindness. Because the value of a person is not determined by the size of their paycheck or the prestige of their title. We are all fighting battles no one else can see. We are all carrying weights no one else can measure, and the moment we start treating people as categories instead of individuals, as functions instead of souls, as stepping stones instead of fellow travelers, that's the moment we lose something essential in ourselves. Victoria Harrington was rich. She was powerful. She was beautiful and educated and accomplished by every metric the world teaches us to value. But until that day on the rooftop, she was also poor in the ways that matter most. Poor in empathy, poor in humility, poor in the basic human capacity to see the humanity in someone who didn't look or dress or live like her. Eric Thompson could have humiliated her. He had every right. He had the power, the platform, the audience hungry for a villain to fall. But he chose something harder. He chose grace. He chose to teach instead of destroy, to build instead of burn, to offer redemption to someone who had offered him nothing but contempt. Some stories end with the villain punished and the hero triumphant, and we walk away satisfied that justice has been served. But the best stories, the truest ones, end with something more complicated, with growth, with change, with the possibility that even people who have done harm can learn to do better. Eric Thompson never wore his wealth like a badge. He never used his story to make himself feel superior. He simply lived with integrity, honored his mother's memory in the most humble way he could think of, and waited to see what kind of world he was really living in. What he found that day in Victoria Harrington's cruelty wasn't just one woman's prejudice. It was a mirror held up to all of us, to the assumptions we make, the shortcuts we take, the way we sort people into boxes labeled worthy and unworthy based on nothing but the surface of things. The question isn't whether you've ever been Victoria. We all have, in small ways, in moments we'd rather not remember. The question is, what do you do now? Who do you choose to see? What stories do you choose to believe? If this story moved you, if it made you think even for a moment about how you see the people around you, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Not for me, for the reminder. Let this channel be the place you come back to when you need to remember that the world is full of hidden depths, that kindness costs nothing, and that the way you treat people when you think no one important is watching is the truest measure of who you are. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance, their job, their circumstances, or have you ever been the one who was misjudged? Share your story. Let's build something here, a community that remembers what it means to see each other, truly see each other, beneath all the surfaces and the labels and the assumptions. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, always remember, you never know who you're looking at. You never know what someone has survived, what they've built, what they carry inside them. So lead with respect, lead with kindness, lead with the grace you'd want someone to show you if they caught you at your worst. Until next time, take care of each other. The world needs more people who look deeper.